it would be unbelievable if somebody was listening to this had never been into flow. Everybody is hardwired for flow. It's built in to human beings, and it's how we perform at our best.
Viktor Frankl once wrote that what man needs is not a tensionless state, but rather to strive and struggle for some goal worthy of him. Recent studies in positive psychology confirm this insight. As good as it feels to be on vacation for a few days or weeks or even months, ultimately, humans need more than that. We need to channel our energy towards something we enjoy. We need to build and create things that we believe make some kind of positive contribution somewhere. So how do we best bring bigger, more deeply meaningful goals into our daily lives? This is a relatively new and fascinating area of study psychologists call engagement, and which many folks interested in peak performance also know as flow. My guest in this special episode of the podcast, 12-time best-selling author Steven Kotler, has probably done more to popularize flow states and explain how everyone can access them than anyone else in the world. Steven defines flow as a state where we feel our best and perform our best, when we're completely immersed in a meaningful goal and playing towards it at the edge of our ability. Studies show a lot of things happen when we access flow. Time seems to stand still, our sense of ego starts to dissolve, and we become capable of things we previously thought were impossible. In addition to his books, Steven also founded the Flow Research Collective, where he's partnered with some of the leading research organizations in the world to study the neuroscience and practical psychology of flow states, breaking down exactly what happens during flow in simple, science-backed steps that anyone can follow. I took most of their courses, and they've quietly revamped my life and career. I actually got to meet Steven in person just a couple months ago at a Flow for Writers workshop in LA, and I really can't recommend their work enough for anyone seeking more enjoyment, better performance, and also fewer burnouts. It was a big case for me, as proper rest and recuperation is a big emphasis for them. It was a great experience getting to pick Steven's brain directly after years of learning from him as an author, researcher, and coach. We discussed how he recovered from a debilitating 3-year bout with Lyme disease with the help of flow, and surfing more specifically, what the 26 known flow triggers have in common, why every human being, not just peak performers, is wired for flow by evolution, how we can bring this amazing tool into our lives in very simple ways, and a lot more. I hope you all enjoy it. This is my conversation with Steven Kotler. Of this is just to share, again, a lot of your insights and your ideas about flow state, and which I've been a student of for many years. So obviously a big part of your life's work has been spreading this knowledge and the tools to help people gain better access to flow states, which can be used obviously for peak performance, but also leads to more well-being, more life satisfaction. I got introduced to your work by Aubrey Marcus and Kyle Kingsbury at On It. And for these guys out there, The Rise of Superman was more than a cult book. It was like a religious book. And so I definitely want to get into some of the mechanics around flow states with you. But before that, I'm really interested and curious in hearing you talk a little bit about how you got started in this journey. So you started your career as an extreme sports reporter, and you lived this very active lifestyle, surfing, traveling, writing for major magazines. And then one day at 30 years old, you contract Lyme disease, which you've described as the worst flu you've ever had, crossed with paranoid schizophrenia. And it's the whole gamut of symptoms, hallucinations, hearing voices, just horrific. And you're afflicted with this condition for 3 years, which I can only imagine how devastating that must have been for someone as active physically and mentally as you. And then a friend of yours shows up to your door and forces you to go surfing. And you initially push back at this because you can't even imagine walking around, but she keeps pushing and you finally accept to go surfing. And then when you get on the board, in the water, muscle memory takes over and you just snap into a different state, a different dimension that you would later discover is a flow experience. And ultimately you go back and you keep having these experiences and you eventually recover from Lyme disease. Now, flow states are usually associated to peak performance or to optimal experiences, but it seems that flow also has therapeutic qualities to it. I mean, do you feel that you were healed by flow in some measure, and how does that work?
It's a great question, and it's actually, so I had sort of seen the other half of the equation, how flow, covering action sports in my 20s, these athletes were using flow to take themselves all the way up to Superman. I didn't know you could go from like seriously subpar, sick for 3 years kind of thing, back to normal. And that was where like it sort of started with me, like, what the hell is going on? The short version, which was true then and is still true today, is two things are important here. First, Lyme is an autoimmune condition. And an autoimmune conditions are essentially a nervous system gone haywire. As we transition into flow, there is a global release of nitric oxide. It's a gaseous signaling molecule. It's everywhere in the body, and it pushes stress hormones out of our system. So this is a really big deal for Lyme for a couple of reasons. One, with a nervous system gone haywire, when you push the stress hormones back out of your system, the system can reset to normal. And if you've been sick with an autoimmune condition for a really long time, your body doesn't know where normal is. So it can't do homeostasis because it's been bounced, it's ping-ponged around for so long. So just by like flushing out the stress hormones, getting rid of the inflammation, your body can reset. And all the neurochemicals that underpin flow, sort of the big five reward chemicals, endorphins, dopamine, serotonin, et cetera, they significantly boost the immune system. So that was known back when I had my experience, and it was mostly work done by Herbert Benson at Harvard, who he did some of the foundational work on, well, that's the relaxation response. When the stress hormones get flushed out of your system, it happens in meditation, it happens in flow, it happens in a number of other altered states of consciousness. He did the foundational work. He's a cardiologist at Harvard. He figured that out. He sort of mapped it out and worked on the chemistry. And all this was known 2000 or so when I wrote that book. What is more recent and equally cool, for example, is flow increases our sense of control over our lives. We start to feel more powerful, more self-confidence, self-esteem. All that stuff tends to go up. And we also get a sense of mastery. Flow pushes on our skills. We use our skills to the utmost to get into the state. So we grow and, our skills expand and it increases mastery. Those are two of the most positive emotions that we can get. And what we now know in the field that is neuroimmunology, which is essentially the fancy way of saying the mind-body connection, but it's the field that studies it. Those two feelings, master and control, significantly increase the number of T cells and killer T cells in our body. So these are major infection fighters, anti-aging things. And so all that stuff also, on top of everything I've been talking about, these are more recent discoveries. And then there's also everything that we now know comes off, just like you mentioned that flow amplifies well-being and happiness. And there's a whole bunch of sort of neuroimmunological effects that just spin off of that as well. So our knowledge of the mechanism has greatly expanded. It's interesting. Herb Benson, years ago, and I think in his book, The Breakout Principle, which is his name for flow, said, hey, I think this process, this biology is what underpins all cases of spontaneous healing, or a lot of them. And I don't know if I would go that far, but it is very interesting in the literature. If you start sort of following those cases and looking for mechanism, you tend to see things like flow showing up much more frequently.
It's so interesting how phenomena that would have been considered like new agey and woo-woo back in the day, today when we sort of study them neurochemically, and you talk about a neurochemical cascade that flow creates, right? You see these performance benefits, but you also see these healing benefits sort of come in. It's kind of very, very fascinating how neuroscience, neurochemistry is bringing all those insights to bear.
Let me put it in slightly different context, because this is really interesting. So we, myself, Dr. Michael Menino, who's a neuroscientist at the Flow Research Collective, Dr. Scott Kelso, who's the godfather of coordination dynamics, and Richard Husky, who's one of the world's leading experts on the neural dynamics of flow. We've got a new paper coming out, hopefully, knock on wood. We have one reviewer to go, but I think it's coming out in the next couple of weeks, on what happens in the brain during the first 2 seconds of flow. So the neural dynamics and neurobiology of flow state onset. And one of the things that we do in the paper is look at a hypothetical thought experiment that compares flow and trauma. And they're interestingly flip sides of this. So one experience goes into flow, and the other experience goes into traumatic stress that could cause PTSD. And it doesn't, like, that seems a little weird to say it, but I could walk you through some of the thinking around it, and you would get it. My point is that the new work on flow, where it's getting really interesting, is things like PTSD. And so when we start talking about like therapeutic benefits, it's starting to get really interesting in that realm as well, because we're starting to really understand, hey, I just had a high risk experience. Sometimes that experience becomes flow, right? And sometimes it becomes trauma. And it's a very thin line, right? It can go either way. And so the question was, well, why does it go one way this time and the other way this time? And so what the insights give us is both like predictive markers for the onset of flow, which is cool because we've never had them before. But it also gives us a way to say, hey, if this is flow and it's sort of the opposite of post-traumatic stress disorder, how do we use one to take care of the other?
Interesting, because risk is one of the flow triggers that you talk about. So, okay, let's take a little step back, because flow experiences are obviously super remarkable for anybody who sort of studies them even a little bit. And getting into flow for a lot of people is they don't know where to start. It's like what is it? So, okay, so they've got these common elements, right? Like you have to have clear goals, full concentration on the task at hand, immediate feedback, a little bit of risk, pushing yourself past your comfort zone. So there's these sort of classic flow triggers. But again, for a lot of people, it just sounds very mystical and distant. Like they don't know where to start.
Let's simplify it. Let me add in a little science. And let's start there. So flow states, as you pointed out, have triggers, preconditions that lead to more flow. 22 have been discovered. There's probably way more, but that's what, actually it's probably, I think it's like 24 now, because a couple new group flow triggers just got added. But there's about 24 that we've discovered. There's way more, as I said. They all have one thing in common. So flow follows focus. It only shows up when all our attention is right here, right now on the task at hand, right? That's critical for flow. And that's what all the triggers do. That's what they have in common. They all drive attention into the now, into the current moment. So how do they do this? They do it one of three ways. If you want to increase your ability to pay attention in the brain, you're either talking about producing the neurochemical dopamine, the neurochemical norepinephrine, are usually both together. Dopamine and norepinephrine. So dopamine and norepinephrine underpins curiosity, for example. What do you get when you're a little curious? You're paying attention to the thing that's in front of you. You're not fighting it, right? You actually turn up the crank on dopamine and norepinephrine, give somebody a lot of that. That's actually the cocktail known as romantic love. Think about when you're falling in love, you can't stop paying attention to the person you're falling in love with. You can't stop thinking about them. That's essentially what all the triggers do. So yes, there's risk and novelty and complexity and unpredictability and pattern recognition. And what are they like? Okay, that's a bunch of big words. They all produce dopamine and norepinephrine. A couple of the other triggers. So you mentioned clear goals, for example, or immediate feedback. So those triggers lower cognitive load or perceived cognitive load, which are actually two different things. But either way, cognitive load is all the crap you're trying to pay attention to at any one time. And if I lighten your cognitive load, what happens is I've liberated some energy. And the brain immediately repurposes that energy for paying attention to the present moment. So when you have clear goals, for example, I know what I'm doing right now. I know what I'm supposed to be doing. I know what a win looks like. I know what I'm doing next. I know where to put my attention. I don't have to think about it. I can totally focus on the now. That helps us maintain focus. It also lowers, we know what we're doing. So we calm down a little bit, right? And the brain can repurpose that energy. So that's sort of what all the triggers have in common. And the truth of the matter is, different people are more susceptible to different triggers in different environments, different times of their life, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's no one toolkit. There's just sort of get familiar with all 24 of them and how they work, and then apply them. And if you can stack multiple triggers in a row, great. And there's certain things that are sort of a little more commonsensical, but are a little harder to figure out. And let me give you an action sport example. So when athletes are younger, they love using risk as a flow trigger. I'm just going to jump off that cliff on my snowboard and I'm going to be in flow and sooner or later, you discover that that's like a fast trip to the hospital. You don't do something dumb and dangerous until you're in a state of optimal performance and performing your best. That's when you want to try the risky, right? So don't use risk at a flow trigger at the front end, trying to get into flow. You want to use risk when you're in flow to lengthen the state because you're already performing at your best. At the front end of flow, so risk is this big burst of dopamine, right? Because you get courage and it amplifies fast twitch muscle response, all these things that you need to deal with to take a risk, but creativity. So when the brain links ideas together, right, that's creativity. And we get rewarded with a little squirt of dopamine from that pattern recognition, right? And so think about that same snowboarder can go out into the mountain and start creatively interpreting terrain features. Maybe they're not hitting the big jump for that big, but oh, there's a little sided over there, and I bet I could throw a 180. Oh, I can throw a snow grind over there. Each time you do that creative interpretation, oh, my body could do this with the terrain, that's pattern recognition. So you do 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 of those things in a row, suddenly you find yourself in a flow state without having to use all the risk. And I'll give you that same thing that I just gave. I'm not allowed to talk about which program does this because they're secretive, but I worked with a fairly decent-sized college football program, and they had this question of, hey, can I get our players into flow in warm-ups? Because the idea was they're going to get hurt less in practice if they're in flow. That was the whole idea. Would it work? We didn't know. So and they always, this particular program started their practice with a 2-lap run a couple, I was a mile for or 2 miles for the faster players. And it was 2 laps for the centers and whatever. And I said, okay, that's fine, but let's just get it off the track and into the woods and have them run through the woods and creatively interpret the landscape, right? If there's a little hill, they run up the side of the hill and they just bank turns, and maybe they can jump and throw 180s, 360s, literally mimicking the stupid shit you would do on their run. And it seemed really dumb. And there was a little there was resistance, right? For the coach.
Was it the novelty factor?
In the beginning, it was just, we're going to take it off road and go into the woods. And that was so novel. It worked. And then as the novelty started wearing off, we layered in more stuff. And it worked. The players got into flow more. What the coaches noticed, the injury rate went down. It wasn't as big as we thought, but what really went up was learning rates, because flow amplifies learning significantly. And so players in flow at the start of practice, suddenly the window was open far longer for learning. And that was really great. This can also, you could do the same thing. I do it cognitively. When I start writing, I don't like facing a blank page, so I edit what I wrote the day before, because editing is about finding little patterns. And I edit a couple sentences in a row, and now I got a little bit of dopamine. So when I get to the blank page, I'm already closer to flow. I've got a lot of focus. I'm excited. I don't have to, muscle so much to pay attention. It's a better experience and a higher chance of getting into flow. So those are, just a handful of ideas. I hope that clarified it a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It's unbelievable that the levels that there are in this flow game. And let's take somebody that listens to this topic and feels like, I've never felt that. I've never felt a flow state. Is it fair to say that it would be maybe more productive for them to start with something that they're very curious about or something that they're already interested in?
Let me stop you there, because this is what you have. So there's 2 things we need to talk about. One, what is it? What is flow? How do you know if you're in flow or not? And 2, it's not a singular experience, and that's the problem. It would be unbelievable if somebody was listening to this had never been into flow. Everybody is hardwired for flow. It's built in to human beings, and it's how we perform at our best. So if anybody's been in a situation where they've consistently performed at their best over time, they've probably been in flow, but they might not have recognized it, because what most people, when they talk about flow, they're actually talking about an experience known as macro flow. And so let me back in. When we define flow as scientists and psychologists and neuroscientists and whatever, from a psychological perspective, we know there are 6 phenomenological characteristics of flow. Big fancy word that means this is how the state makes you feel. Complete concentration on the task at hand. There's a merger of action and awareness. There's a vanishing of your sense of self. Your sense of self gets quieter, right? Time passes strangely. In fact, when anyone's been in a car crash, much more frequently it speeds up, and a couple hours go by in a couple of minutes. And we don't experience peak performance on the inside. Instead, we feel two things. One, we have this incredible sense of control. Oh my God, I can control things I can't normally control. This could be a basketball player, right, in the zone, and suddenly the hoop looks as big as a hula hoop, right, and they cannot miss. This could be me, 5 a.m. on a Monday. Suddenly, like, I'm in flow and the words are doing things the words don't normally do at 5 a.m. on Monday, right? And like, or it could be businessman or businesswoman leading a meeting, right? And the meeting's going really well, and the questions are sort of like one is following the next, and the ideas are bouncing off the wall, and it's sort of a great brainstorming session. That's group flow in action too, and you feel this sense of, oh my God, I'm steering this meeting so well. So that's the sense of control. And finally, flow is autotelic, which is a fancy way of saying this state is unbelievably euphoric. It's joyous. It's addictive. It's so pleasurable. Once we experience flow, we can't wait to do more of the thing that dropped us into flow because it's that pleasurable. And as you mentioned earlier, like, people rate flow as the most pleasurable experience on earth, and consistently. It's because nobody ever has a bad time in a flow state. So even all those other like hedonic pleasures, sex, drugs, whatever, anybody who's played around in those worlds knows that goes bad as often as it goes good, right? Nobody has a bad time in a flow state. It doesn't go bad.
And there's a hedonic adaptation too, which you don't see like with flow. You just want more of the experience, and it kind of builds up. There's that well-being buildup, as opposed to hedonic states, which, yeah, you sort of keep chasing for that high and sort of get like a diminishing returns over time.
Csikszentmihalyi once said that like flow is an addiction, and it's like it's like other addictions, except flow is an addiction that leads forward into the future because you're always pushing your skills to the utmost and you're learning and you're growing. He said, unlike other addictions, drugs, sex, gambling, whatever, that tend to lead backwards, right? Same mechanisms. One leads forwards, the other tends to lead backwards, or at least sideways.
Yeah, right. Very interesting.
So there's some people who are just absolutely phenomenal at managing their addictions, and it works for them. And, it sort of leads them sideways, and you got to there's a lot of the modern world that is essentially addiction management. Flow too. Like, flow is an addictive state. You have to be careful with it in certain ways. And in the same way, like, it's, it requires some adult responsibility.
You're right. And I think Csikszentmihalyi also talks about an experience that makes the self more complex. So it makes you more differentiated over time.
Oh, you've done your homework.
A little bit.
Right, yeah, so a lot of people don't know this. Csikszentmihalyi did a lot of work on adult development and a lot of work on sort of evolution, adaptation, and things like that. And he has argued essentially that flow is the mechanism for adult development. It's how we grow up. We grow up through flow. To put it differently, there's an evolutionary theory of flow. There's a bunch of ideas about how flow first emerged, but what kept it going and why is it everywhere? And it's not just humans. Most mammals get in flow. So like, what did it? And one of the things that we talk about, or that's been talked about, comes off of what you just said, is flow, they think, is a signal for mastery. So at an internal level, if you're trying to like steer an organism safely through a hostile environment, it's a good idea to like know when you've mastered certain skills. Like, do I know how to fight? Because if you don't know how to fight, you don't want to put your body in certain environments, especially, before the advent of modern medicine, right? Like, for sure. So having a signal of, oh, I've really mastered this is actually adaptively beneficial. So there's a whole bunch of thinking that says one of the reasons flow has stuck around for so long and become so powerful is that it's this signal for mastery. Oh, you've learned this thing. You can trust that you've got it. And it may not even be, so like, it may be a conscious signal, but it's probably a much more powerful signal to the adaptive unconscious. Right. So at an unconscious level, the 95% of the brain that's running stuff behind the scenes, it knows you got this, which is sort of a really big deal.
It's another connection between what you say about how flow is, we're sort of wired for flow. It's connected to our adaptive capabilities. It's evolutionarily, obviously, very useful. I want to talk to you about a concept that you write a lot about, very, very interestingly, the challenge to scale ratio. So I grew up in the 80s and 90s, and our ultimate hero growing up was Michael Jordan. And I think we superficially understood Jordan's mentality at the time as this sort of very hard driving mentality, always push yourself. I mean, today people talk about hustle culture. You have a lot of this mentality in the corporate world, the 80-hour weeks, work till you drop, basically push as hard as you can for as long as you can. And I think, again, I think this is an oversimplification of what the masters do, but it's the way that it's understood by a lot of people. And in the challenge to skill, balancing the challenge to skill ratio, and in other concepts you talk about, sort of seem to point towards a much trickier balance. So in flow, it turns out that we sometimes use a lot less of the brain and not more. There's also a relaxation or a release phase leading to peak performance, this lowering of brain activity. So it's not so simple as just pushing yourself to the brink and just always doing more. Can you talk a little bit about why that is? Why we actually need a trickier balance between pushing ourselves super hard and also relaxing to kind of create that optimal experience?
So inadvertently, there's like 4 questions sort of mashed together. So I'm going to say this out loud so you can remind me, because in 5 minutes when I go, where the hell was I and what did I need to say? So let's start with the challenge skills balance, and then let's go to the flow cycle, because there's 2 parts to this. But I want to start actually with something funny, because people don't realize this about Jordan. So play versus comp, like the image of Jordan is like fierce competition, Kobe, it's like the Kobe, the Mamba mentality and all that stuff. And by the way, I'm wired that way on a lot of levels, and I totally get it. And it's really funny because I'll listen to like Kobe's speeches, and I will think to myself 2 things. I will think, oh, he sounds a little bit like you, and 2, he sounds fucking crazy, right? Like you hear it out loud, you're like, wow, that just sounds crazy, right? But on the inside, it doesn't feel crazy. And the reason is the challenge skills balance. But even before we get there, so play is universal in mammals, and there are biological, physiological telltale signs of play. In animals, we always see the play bow, right? You put your chest to the ground. Dogs do this all the time. It goes across species. Humans sort of do. We just lower our posture a little. But one of the signs that you are playing, and play is really flowy, is that you have your tongue hanging out of your mouth. That's always a sign that you're playing. Right? It's universal in mammals. And the thing about Jordan, like whatever you want to say about like the Mamba mentality, I'm grinding out, whatever, your facial expression says you're playing. And so however hard you're going, you're playing. You're out there playing, and that's flowy as hell. And it's worth pointing that out because nobody ever talks about it. But like, there's no think about, why would you play basketball with your tongue sticking out of your mouth? There's no reason to do it unless it was actually. So that is worth pointing out. Besides the point, or besides challenge skills balance, flow follows focus. We pay the most attention to the task at hand when that challenge of the task slightly exceeds our skill set. So you want to stretch but not snap, right? And so the easiest way to talk about this is to put some numbers on it, and these are not real numbers. So a bunch of years ago, before he passed, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, godfather of flow psychology, sat down with a Google mathematician, and they said, can we put a number on the difference between challenge and skills? The back of the envelope calculation, this was not real. The number they came up with was 4%. We took that 4% and tried to play with it and tried to test it and ran a couple years worth of like, you can't call them research yet because it was really hard to like, how do you map 4% exact? Like it was weird and hard and tricky. And, but we found that it was deadly accurate, like as a metaphor at least. And what we found with 4% is like if you're shy or if you're meek, if you're timid, if you're a little cautious, or if you're any of those areas where that comes up in your personality, right? Like you may not be a shy, timid person, but you may not like public speaking, and suddenly you're like, we can get to speak in public and suddenly you're shy and timid, whatever the case. Flow demands that you get comfortable with being uncomfortable. You got to push slightly outside your sweet spot. Hard charging type A types will take on challenges that are 10, 20, 30, 40% bigger than their skill level, just for like the thrill of it and because it helps them pay attention, right? And I'm not saying don't go after the big challenges. Those are actually great for motivation, but you got to chunk it down so what's right in front of you is slightly above your skill set, right? So you're back in that 4% sweet spot. And here's something that's interesting. Most of my work in the past couple of years has been on peak performance aging. And as we age, as unconscious fears sort of build up, you get injured, things go wrong, you start to build up that sweet spot may shrink even further. So what may be like 4% at 30 can get down to like 2% in your 50s. And especially like if you're an athlete in your 50s, you're used to pushing like 4 or 5%, and pushing 2% doesn't feel right because you've learned it one way, and now you have to shift it, and you find yourself locked out of flow. And it's because you're actually pushing too hard. You back off more, you'll get in. And the way I like to talk about it is in flow, it's often you got to go slow to go fast. The next step out, and then I'll shut up so you can get to your next question, is flow is not a light switch. It's not a binary. You're not in the zone or out of the zone. It's actually a 4-stage process. And you got to move through each stage to get back into flow. And the first stage is a struggle phase. You're loading the brain with information, and it's very unflowy, right? You talked about how the prefrontal cortex gets quiet in flow. In struggle, it's super active. It's trying to puzzle solve. It's trying to learn stuff. It's acquiring skills and acquiring knowledge and preparing, right? And you sort of want to bring yourself to the brink of total frustration. Then you want to pause. You mentioned that, like, you want to relax, you want to chill, right? You want to take your mind off the problem. Flow requires you to like learn the stuff consciously and then pass it over to the subconscious, which is way more powerful and can do a lot of problem solving, puzzle solving, and learning for you. So to do that, you got to take your mind off the problem. And so like low grade physical activity is great here. This is why you hear so many people talking about long walks, right? I love walking my dogs for like this activity. Gardening works really, really well. You can work out, but you don't want to exhaust the brain, because what comes next is flow. So you just want to relax. This is, by the way, people have great ideas in the shower. Why? It's because you struggled all day with the thing, and you come home and you jump into the shower, and it's not exactly a flowy experience, but it's got some of the flow triggers baked in, and it's just enough to distract you that suddenly the good ideas start popping, and suddenly you find yourself in the front end of like a cognitive flow state in the shower. All of a sudden, here's the answer. Right. So that's an experience a lot of us have had. And then on the back end, there's a recovery phase. So you gotta like flow's neurobiologically expensive to produce. It's a heavy state. We use a lot of energy. So you gotta chill out. And really, if you want to really use flow to your advantage, you need deep delta wave sleep, because a lot of learning takes place in flow. But until you get into deep delta wave sleep, have a good night's sleep, you can't turn it from short-term memory into long-term storage. It won't make that jump. You need sleep on the back end of a flow state. So you need an active recovery protocol and a lot of sleep. I want to go back to something a loop we left open earlier. Flow's got these 6 conditions. You can be in microflow, which is when they show up, but they're dialed down to like 1 or 2. So you said most of these people don't even believe they've been in flow. They've all had the experience where they sit down to write like a quick email to the boss. And like you get so sucked into what you're doing that an hour goes by and you look up and you're like, oh my God, I wrote an essay. And maybe like your sense of self and self-consciousness didn't totally go away, but bodily awareness sure did, because you pop back into consciousness. You have to run to the bathroom because you hadn't been aware of the fact that your bladder had been screaming at you for like 20 minutes, right? That happens to all of us all the time. The other end of the spectrum, macro flow, where it's turned up to 11. For a long time, people thought these were mystical experiences. Right? They didn't know it was flow. They didn't know what it was. And weird things happen in macro flow. Time can slow down. You can have a sense of being one with everything. You can have out-of-body experiences. We understand all the neurobiology under where that comes from now, but it doesn't change the fact that when you have those experiences, they're wild. You know what I mean? I'm one of the leaders in the world on this stuff, but I have a deep flow experience. It still feels like a mystical experience to me. Right? That doesn't go away. That's what makes it so wonderful.
It's unbelievable how there's all these what I love in your work. There's all these counterintuitive ideas, like the release, the slowing down phase before you get. And I've started doing this in the sauna, for instance. Like I'm working on a problem, and then I go in the sauna. I just go into that meditative state, and then I'll get ideas pop out that I can't produce consciously when I'm just pushing myself. Right. So I've started having some of these experiences through your work. And another counterintuitive concept in flow is that when people think about flow, they think about a me experience. They think about, I'm going to get into a flow state. And it's clear that flow states are multidimensional, right? There's a performance aspect, there's a healing aspect, there's engagement, but there's also purpose. And in your fantastic book, The Art of Impossible, which is really, I couldn't recommend highly enough. It's just an unbelievably practical book. In many senses, a new kind of book, because I feel like it's a guide, but it's just so well put together in narrative form as well that it just kind of works really, really nice as a guide to sort of get people educated on how to access flow states. And one of the things you write about in The Art of Impossible is that passion is selfish, right? And that to gain flow, it helps to connect our experience to a broader purpose beyond ourselves, right? That we need to go beyond just ego-driven focus to achieve more flow. Why is that? From your perspective, why is purpose so important to achieving flow?
So I'm going to back up one step, which is for peak performance, it's hard, right? Peak performance is hard. So you need all the motivation you can get. And we humans come with 5 big, giant motivators. And we're engineered biologically, evolutionarily. One builds into the next, builds into the next, builds into the next. So at the front end of the stack is curiosity. We talked about it, like a little bit of focus for free. Curiosity is biologically designed to be built into passion. I talk about how that happens in The Art of Impossible. Once you have passion is great. It's a big fire, right? But as you pointed out, it's a fairly selfish experience. And neurobiologically, it's norepinephrine and dopamine sort of turned up to the max. You can't get any more of those neurochemicals. So I give you more dopamine. At that point, I've got schizophrenia. And if I give you more norepinephrine, I've got mania or OCD or stuff like that. So I can't crank it up anymore. But what I have to do is I want to add in more reward chemicals. And the other reward chemicals that are available are all the social bonding chemicals, oxytocin, serotonin, and endorphins. To do that, we are built to turn passion into purpose. So this is the thing that fires me up. How can I use the thing that fires me up to help the world? That move automatically gives you oxytocin, serotonin, endorphins. These are all the social bonding chemicals. There's a bunch of downstream benefits from that as well. We could talk about wisdom and empathy and things like that come out of this. But from a motivation standpoint, oh my God, like endorphins are pleasure drugs. There's like 20 in the brain, but like they're opiates, right? They're our internal version of external opiates like Oxycontin and heroin and morphine. And the most common endorphin in the brain is 100 times more powerful than medical morphine. So these are big highs. Like you're talking about really big motivational drugs that, like, we know how addictive Oxycontin is. There's a plague of heroin or of Oxycontin addiction in the country right now. That we get internal versions, right? That are really beneficial. And that's the same chemical that underpins mother-child bonding. So it's endorphins. In fact, you can treat separation distress in animals with non-addictive, or in humans, by the way, and you can treat depression in humans with non-addictive opiates for the same reason. And it takes care of a lot of it. So purpose, while it sounds really lofty from a neurobiological motivation, oh my God, you get way more drugs. Right? Like you do way more fun drugs and pleasure drugs and a lot more motivation. And you also pay way more attention to it, right? If you've got curiosity turning into passion, turning into purpose, oh my God, are you paying attention to it? And what does that give you? That gives you a shitload of flow. So, and those are the first 3 of the big 5 motivators. Then there's autonomy, which is just the freedom to pursue your purpose, and mastery, the skills to pursue it well. So you get all 5 of those going, and there's a lot of drive and a ton of flow, which, as you know, boosts motivation even further. And what you've done is this is sort of this virtual feedback loop. There's a little bit of goal setting that needs to be layered in to take it the full step of the way. But I'll let people read Art Impossible for that one.
No, but I find it really interesting, Stephen. I'd like to know what you think about this point. It's almost like we're evolutionarily designed or hardwired for us to take our performance to the ultimate level. It's like we have to access that final door. We have to do things that will also help others in some way. Would you say that's accurate?
So it's interesting because it goes a little farther than that in a really cool, weird ass way. And you mentioned this earlier, and I don't know if you've seen this. So in Optimal Experience, I think, which is the flow book that nobody reads. It's a Chick Sent Me High book that looked at the first 10 years of flow research. So like 70 to 80, I think it is what it was, or 75 to 85. Obviously, nobody goes back. You have to be a total flow geek historian to go back, but Chick Sent Me High wrote the opening and the closing essay in it. And if you put them two together, it's sort of like the clearest look at like all the stuff he also felt about flow, but didn't put into all the other books. And he talks about how flow, it underpins wisdom. It expands empathy automatically. And wisdom is this actual psychophysiological trait. And one of the cool things about wisdom, and this is what's really neat, is it's neuroprotective against cognitive decline. If you want to like make sure you're not going to get dementia and Alzheimer's as you age, you want three things matter. You want to be an optimist as early as possible, like in your 20s. You want to be optimistic. You also want sort of regular access to expertise. You want to develop expertise because the way expertise forms in the brain and the neural networks that form, they're impervious to cognitive decline and wisdom. So wisdom is all the social rules that like it's the unspoken processes and stuff that's in between everything else. And flow makes the learning of wisdom autotelic itself. So flow becomes this sort of like engine of adult development that drives us forward and, interestingly, protects us against cognitive decline in our later years, which is really neat. So like the more flow you get along the way, the more proof of expertise and wisdom you're gaining along the way, the longer you're going to be able to hold on to those skills and the longer you're going to be able to perform at your best into your later years, which is really cool. It's a very like closed biological system.
It's so cool. My brain would literally explode with questions and with wanting to go deeper, but I know our time is limited. I have one topic I really want to get to, and you've touched on it, and that's empathy. And first of all, that's I don't want to minimize what you've just laid down as knowledge from that, going back to like the original book on optimal experience. It's just so wow, the fact that again these concepts that we talked about in philosophy, like wisdom, can actually be protective of our brains as we age.
It's even cooler, like this concept of wisdom. So Dylan Jest, he's at UC Santa Barbara. You can look it up if you want, Jeste. He has broken down the neurobiology of wisdom. We know the exact brain areas that are active that produce the traits that we call wisdom. It's really a cool field of study, and it's very related to empathy. We know in flow, empathy automatically increases. And it happens because, so there's a part of your brain, the temporal parietal junction, and this part of your brain does perspective. So when you see things from another person's perspective, this part of your brain gets really active. When you have an out-of-body experience, by the way, same part of the brain. Why? What is an out-of-body experience? It's a radical shift in perspective. Essentially, like the first time I went skydiving, I had an out-of-body experience, jumped right out of the plane and jumped right out of my body and watched the whole thing take place. Why would that happen? Because the brain goes, holy shit, you've just jumped out of an airplane. You could be dying. We have to solve this problem. Let's radically shift your perspective because we're out of ideas over here. Maybe you can see something from up here that saves your life right now. That's sort of one of the things that happens in out-of-body experiences.
It's expanded consciousness. You describe it as a form of consciousness expansion, is how you've talked about it.
Yeah, in a sense, from a neurobiological perspective, and we sort of do it all the time when we see things from another perspective, right? Like we do all the other stuff. We just don't realize the brain can do it physically as well, right? But it can. And it does. That's the same portion of the brain that like does body position in space, which is also like what direction am I looking is what perspective am I taking, right? So the body does all that stuff at the same place. When we're empathetic, when we like walk a mile in somebody's moccasins, to use the cliche, that's about the temporal parietal junction. And it as it gets more active in flow, we take on other people's perspectives, and this is the same engine of adult development. This is one of the things that happens as adult development takes place is we gain, and it really starts to come alive in our 50s and 60s because the brain starts to change in such a way to like really support this. But to bring it back to flow, we've had the privilege over the past couple of years, the Flow Research Collective, with working with a bunch of different law enforcement organizations in America. And it's interesting. And the reason that the folks at the top know because of what, George Floyd, the social justice movement, empathy, if you can't get more empathy into the police force, we're going to have real problems. The cops themselves are dying for peak performance. They just want to be able to perform at their best and do their job. And some of them are really interested in empathy, and some of them, have other feelings, but it doesn't matter. We're training them in flow, and everybody sort of gets what they want. So I think that's really neat. And what I like about flow, I'm a lifelong environmentalist and an animal rights advocate and things like that. And flow doesn't just increase empathy, it also increases ecological awareness, which is our ability to see, perceive, and care about, feel empathy for the natural world. So you get like empathy for all people, but it also extends beyond the line of species into plants and animals and ecosystems. And from an environmental perspective, that's phenomenal. Like facing the environmental challenges we now face, we need that. So in a sense, those are the reasons I really like. Intellectually, flow is a puzzle that I want to solve. And I like writing about it because I like making art. So like, in a sense, those things are very, very selfish. The training stuff, I'm less interested in. I always say that my altruism is usually about animals. Like I want to help animals. I'm willing to help people and run the collective and do all that because what I get in the bargain is more empathy and more environmental awareness in the world. And that solves problems that I'm trying to solve. So I think it's a fair trade. Right, the same trade that's happening in law enforcement. That's in a sense sort of one of the reasons I started the Flow Research Collective. I wanted to do the training right, and I wanted to do it at scale. But one of the reasons I wanted to do it at scale is I think it's a better world with more empathy and more, environmental awareness.
It's unbelievable how these different perspectives merge when you start studying flow. We think of empathy as like this pro-social thing or like being nice or being kind. And then there's the peak performers.
Let me put all this in context for you because it's actually, there's one big frame that will help here. So you should, as any skeptical, healthy-minded human being, hear all the things flow expands, right? Like you get empathy and ecological awareness and motivation and learning and creativity and fast twitch muscle response and strength. And anybody should hear this list and be like, what the fuck? Like what? What is that? Right? And so here's the piece in the puzzle that is really useful. Flow is optimal performance. It's all of us. So why is flow ubiquitous? And one of the reasons is it's shaped by evolution. Now, what is evolution shaped by? Evolution is the principal driver of evolution is scarcity of resources. When resources are scarce, you have two options. You can fight over the dwindling resources, right? Or you can flee to avoid being somebody else's resources. Or you can get creative, get cooperative, get innovative, and make new resources. So why does flow amplify all this stuff? It's amplifying everything you need to fight or flee and get right, or to get cooperative, get creative, get innovative, and make new resources. That's what's being amplified because that's the original driver.
And that's the link between sort of performance.
And I mean, if you want to make new resources, you need empathy. Right? If you don't care about the people around you and you can't see things from their perspective, it's really hard to get cooperative and share resources. And make that approach really requires collaboration, cooperation, all the social skills that get amplified in flow too.
Unbelievable. Look, I want to be careful because my time dimension is becoming dilated and I want to respect yours. And so generally speaking, I don't do promos or sponsorships at all on this podcast. It's part of what I believe in terms of maintaining independence, avoiding conflicts of interest and so forth. But I just have to say personally that your program, Zero to Dangerous, has absolutely transformed my productive life, especially my burnouts. I used to drive so hard, Stephen. I used to burn out 3-4 times a year. And so I know that you guys talk about the performance benefits. I'm like, I'm performing fine. I just don't want to burn out anymore. But it also did improve my performance, as crazy as that sounds. I did not even believe in the notion that I'm going to perform as well if I'm not going to burn out. I just wanted to stop burning out and I wanted to sort of align with my purpose a little bit more. But I ended up also getting the performance benefits, which is something that was really that I did not believe in. I said, let's try this out as a learner. I was interested in it. So obviously the Art of Impossible, I believe, is an amazing place to start. But I also highly encourage people to look into Zero to Dangerous and your other online programs, because they're just absolutely game changing when it comes to people's productive lives and helping them align their productivity to their purpose and to experience more flow. Where would you say is the best place for people to find you, to get more information about your latest programs, your latest books, and what you're interested in lately?
Two places. If you're very flow focused, you want to go to the flowresearchcollective.com. Definitely, check out the video page. There's a lot of free stuff there. All the classes that you just spoke about. Thank you. That was really nice of you to say. I one of the things that sort of I like to point out when here's something like that. That makes me especially happy, because peak performance is nothing more than getting your biology to work for you rather than against you. And that's the really cool thing. Like, if you just do the things, right? Like the way the program works, you're optimizing your biology. You're going to get you get crazy benefits. Here's a random one. We don't do this. We don't talk about it. I don't even think this is the first time I've probably ever mentioned anywhere. People lose substantial amounts of weight in Zero to Dangerous. Now, there's very little nutrition stuff around flow. We know it's a high energy state. You got to eat right. You need plenty of hydration. But we sort of talk a little bit about this is what macronutrients are, and it's like a very general. Here's how you eat healthy for high energy, but we make no dietary nothing, and yet people consistently lose 20, 30 pounds along the way. It's not what they came for either. It's just happening, and it keeps showing up in our data. We laugh about it. We're like, there's probably a weight loss version of this, but we're so science driven that doing the science to get it there is going to take a couple of years, and we haven't even started. But it's really funny. But what I like about all of it is I know we can get a 70 to 80% boost in flow in almost anybody, because we consistently get it for clients. But it's not we're good at teaching it and we're good at training it, but it's actually just the biology that's doing the heavy lifting, right? You do the work, the biology does the heavy lifting, and you can be as skeptical as you want, which is great. That's the best part about it, is bring that healthy level of skepticism in, you know what I mean? And don't take my word for it. Run the frickin' experiment and just see what your own biology can do for you. That was a long-winded way of saying I don't know what about our website. But the other thing is StephenKotler.com. So that's where you can find me and stuff about the books. And if the new book, In Our Country, is about peak performance aging, drops in February. And that's the peak performance aging stuff that we talked about that was sort of woven in, the wisdom and all that shit. That's where it lives.
Yeah. And I've signed up to that as well, because I'm starting to hit my mid-40s and definitely interested in seeing the connection.
Are you in the beta class? Have I just not seen you?
Yeah, I am because the time shifted.
Oh my God, I'm so sorry. It's the reason is you're all looking at me. So when I scroll through the faces, y'all see me scrolling through the faces, and it's embarrassing.
The thing is, Stephen, I haven't called into the lives because I like the time shifted aspect of it. My schedule is so insane. So that's probably why you haven't seen me in it, but I've definitely signed up, and I can't wait to get into that journey, because as I said, really you've mentioned adult development. It's also, a lot of this is really just the science of aging, also how to age more gracefully, how to achieve more and more of your goals. The aging component is a really big part of this.
It's interesting too. You wouldn't know it. Because flow plays such a big role in adult development, and maybe because of where Mihaly sent me high, his core interest, that it ended up this way. But you're not wrong. There's a very clean line between sort of flow and how it sort of moves through our lives in terms of driving us forward. It's interesting. It's bigger than I actually thought it was, in terms of its scope biologically, which I found really interesting. Was sort of one of the things that was really fun about doing the research for the class and the book and all that stuff. But it really does. All the research really does say that, the old idea was the long, slow rot theory of aging, and the new idea is hey, all those skills we used to think decline with age, they certainly decline with age. And if you don't pay attention to them, they're going to slide away. But they're all use it or lose it skills, it turns out. That's what we've learned. And so if you keep learning, using them, and you know what they are and how to train them, you're going to hang on to a lot of stuff until very, very late in life. It's pretty spectacular.
It is spectacular. And it reminds me of something Csikszentmihalyi wrote about when he talks about turning your whole life into
a flow experience, sort of linking up all the different elements of your life into a flow experience. And that aging component, I'm so excited that you're working on that, and I can't wait to dive in. So thank you so much. I mean, this has been unbelievably, I just couldn't put my pen down. I was just like taking notes like wildly as you were talking, because I'm actually going to look into a lot of the stuff we talked about. But thanks a lot. This has been fantastic, and keep it up. Honestly, all of us who are learning from you are just, it's unbelievable the benefits we're getting in our lives, in our productive lives, in our working in our purpose, experiencing more flow. As we feel better, we start sort of bringing in more and more of the different elements, like you talked about, the nutrition. It's all sort of interconnected in the end to creating optimal experience. And I find that your work is just so instrumental in helping all of us achieve higher levels of well-being and also higher levels of performance. So thank you so much, and please keep it up.
It's incredibly nice of you to say. Thank you.